Nothing will crush a real estate investor's spirit like landlord stress. The difference between being successful and miserable in managing properties is education. Welcome to Landlord University, where landlords learn. Landlord University is recorded from inside the RentPrep office, where Stephen White and Jeff Pearson share the lessons learned from working with some of the most successful landlords.
Welcome to Landlord University Night School. I'm Jeff Pearson. I'm here with my co-host, Stephen White. Hello, Stephen. How are you doing this evening?
Hey, Jeff, pretty good. So we've got a episode today that's going to be talking about reasons to allow a tenant to break their lease, and kind of what prompted me to pick this as a topic was an article that I read on Bigger Pockets blog. I'm over there often. They've got a lot of good stuff, and this is from a gentleman who wrote it, Kevin Perk. I'm actually a pretty big fan of. He owns a property management company out of Memphis, Tennessee, and as I was telling you before we started recording, um, I like the way that he writes. He writes from a perspective of here's the problems that I've run into, and here's the way that I have found to resolve them. So I think for a lot of landlords, they want to learn from that perspective, and so he's definitely somebody to keep an eye out for whenever he puts out a new article.
Yep.
And we'll obviously include a link in the show notes to the article if you want to take a look at it. But I thought it was, something worth talking about because a lot of times we'll get phone calls here from a landlord that says, "Hey, I've had this tenant in my property for 9 months or whatever, and they haven't fulfilled their lease term, and they want out." And I think there's a part of them that doesn't want to let them out, obviously, but then there's a part of them that feels that sense of responsibility, like I should let them out, and if it's a legitimate reason. Um, I don't think that there's anything wrong with letting somebody out of their lease if there's a good reason for it. It's certainly not worth your trouble in a lot of cases to try and fight them on it if it's one of these reasons that we're going to discuss. So, just something to pull out your notepad and jot down a couple of ideas so that way if you do run into the situation, um, your first instinct isn't to be defensive and say, "Well, what do you mean you want to break the lease?" I mean, there's a lot of cases where it might be appropriate for them to break the lease.
Yeah, I think one of the things that it's important for landlords to keep in mind is the law doesn't say you have to hold them to that lease. And if they break the lease, then you have to make them fulfill the obligations of the lease. What this is doing is this is protecting both of you. You've entered a contract. They're agreeing to make payments every month to rent the property, treat the properly. Your obligation in that contract is to provide that property to them, allow them to stay in that property through the term of the lease. That's pretty simple. But if they come to you and say, "I need to break the lease and this is the reason why," then you as a business person and as a person need to stop and think, why are they doing this? Is there truly a need on their part to break it? Are they doing this maliciously? Or is this just a natural course of life and this is a decision they have to make? And certainly these topics that you're going to be bringing up in a few minutes are the most important ones to really consider giving them the opportunity to break the lease without holding them accountable to the terms of the lease. But at the same time, be a little bit reasonable about it because you'll create more problems and stress for yourself to try to fight it, maybe take them to court or whatever it is, than to just say, "I understand, if we can just work a little bit on this, give me an extra 2 weeks rent, we'll just call it a day." That would be a good way to do it. But I think these topics that he brings up in the blog give us a really good starting point of thinking about things that are just beyond people's control. And it makes sense for us as business people and as people to give them the ability to move on and move forward.
Yeah. And I think I'll start it out by saying, one of the really most common misconceptions that I hear from especially new landlords, and you touched on it a little bit, was the idea that if they have I'll just get for easy numbers, if they have a 1 year lease and they were there for 6 months, they're not legally obligated to pay the remaining 6 months. And you will never find a court that's willing to charge them the remaining
Exactly.
6 months. And I think a lot of landlords have that misconception that, okay, there's 6 months remaining. You now owe me 6 months worth of rent. and it will never work out that way in your favor. And regardless of what your lease agreement might say or how it's worded, it's just simply not going to ever be the case. And I have a lot of experience in the collection industry and have a lot of experience collecting on past due rent. And I can tell you that we have never, not once ever, been able to charge more than 2.5 times the month's worth of rent. So if they had 6 months remaining, you took them to court. The court will always say, 2.5 months is like the max as far as time that you would need to turn that property over and find
That's
something.
that's the important part. Time you need to turn the property over. Essentially what you're contracted to as a landlord is if they break their lease, you have to do everything you can to get that rented as soon as reasonably possible. And yeah, 2.5 months is a reasonable amount of time, unless you could prove that they damaged the place to such a great extent that it took you longer than that to prepare it to bring it to market. If you had substantiated reasons that delayed you from putting it on the market, but you have to assume you're going to be able to rent it within about a month and a half to 2.5 months. And so it makes sense. Don't think that they're going to owe you for all of those months of rent left on the agreement anyways. So what's the value to you to fight it?
Right, exactly. I was just going to bring that up. And even if there is damages, you're separating those charges. You're not lumping that into past due rent.
Right.
Those are two different things. They're looking at damages and then past due rent. So, and you're right. What's it worth to pay your attorney or your time to show up in court, your time to file everything, and the stress of having to fight it? I think more than not, it's worth it to just say, okay, this is a situation outside of everyone's control, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's a situation that works out for the better, and say, okay, if you lost your job, which is one of the reasons that we'll talk about, um, what's the point in me trying to fight you on it? You're probably not going to be able to pay the rent next month anyway.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. You,
you know,
you would be causing more problems for yourself holding
mhm,
them to a lease that they're telling you they can't afford to pay than to say, I understand, as a person, you feel bad that they lost their job and they can't pay rent and stay where they're living. They're probably moving in with friends or family and they're going to be, taking on a room or maybe even living in their car. You don't know. So yeah, you have to be reasonable and you have to look at it from a standpoint of what would this truly cost me to try to enforce the terms of this lease agreement. And okay, 2.5 months rent. Is it going to cost you more in time and worry than you would get for 2.5 months rent?
yeah. And let's all consider as well, kind of a cash for keys concept.
I was just thinking that too.
Yeah, I mean, the more you put up a fight, in my opinion, the more chances you have of them doing damage or something spiteful,
Mm-hmm.
just for the sake of sticking it to you. That
Exactly.
a lot of times it's just easier to just say, okay, and let's find a way to deal with it, and like you said, within reason. Hey, listen, 2 weeks or whatever the case is, we'll call it a day. And I think that being flexible in that way is not only going to save you that time and aggravation, but could also save your property from purposely being damaged as well.
Yes.
So one of the legitimate reasons that Kevin talks about, and I see often, is military. If they're active or reserve and they get
Mm-hmm.
deployed, the thing that you got to worry about is, in some cases, yeah, you're required to hold the property for them until they return. Um, doesn't mean that you have to hold it and they don't have to pay rent. It means that if they move or if they leave, that you have to come up with a plan for keeping the utilities on enough to maintain the property. So if you're in a colder climate, you got to make sure that the heat stays on and you're not going to, freeze up the pipes and everything. But if they're open with you and say, listen, I'm going to be gone to Afghanistan or wherever it might be for 6 months, and I'd like to come back and be in the same place, work with them. Say, okay,
Yes.
let's come up with a plan. Let's set up automatic rent payments if you don't have it already. Let's come up with a utility plan on how you're going to scale down your utilities. Some things you may be able to shut off, like cable, and who knows, maybe electric. But some things you may want to keep on.
Mm-hmm.
So good communication is going to be required in that case. If they tell you that they're being deployed or maybe they're being stationed somewhere else. And having been in the military myself, and Jeff, I believe you were in the military, right?
No, I come from a
Oh,
military family, but
that's
I
right.
didn't make it in. I had flat feet, believe it or
No,
not.
I think we all do after a certain age
Right.
anyway.
Well, I actually had corrective surgery on mine, and that was the
Uh,
part that kept me from being able to get in. But both my parents were in the army.
well,
Both my brothers were in the military.
yeah, and well, then I mean, a lot of times you don't get a say. It's not
Right.
like they call you and say, "Hey, how do you feel about being stationed in North Carolina now?" Or how do you feel? You just
Hmm.
you get the orders and you go, and you have a certain time to be there. So in those cases, it really is out of their control,
Yes.
and there's really no sense in trying to make anything more difficult for them. They're going to be gone, and so in those cases, you just again, good communication is really necessary. Find out what their situation is, why they're leaving for the military. Is it a deployment and they'll be back? Is it moving duty stations and now they're going to be across the country or possibly across the world?
Hmm.
So really understand what their situation is and then act accordingly from there.
And it's the least we can do for the service
Yeah,
members who are serving our country.
absolutely. And especially for if they are talking about deployment. Um, Usually there, at least when I was in, we had a whole team set up of people in sort of like an admin role that were helping people organize their bills and their responsibilities for when they left.
Hmm.
So they have a team of people that will help them to organize how the rent's going to be paid and how the utilities are going to be paid. So, they've got a lot of support on their end too that can make it work and make it happen and make it an easy, smooth process for everybody.
Yes.
So, all right, job transfer. So when I read this on the job transfer, Kevin mentions, a lot of times it may be worth it to put in your lease that, like a clause in there that says, if you have a job transfer and it takes you 50 miles away, then you can break the lease. And the first thing I thought of when I read that was the old days of gym memberships.
Hmm.
And I remember being locked into a Bailey's gym membership. When I was in my early 20s probably, and I wanted to get out, and I was trying to find ways to get out, and I read that in the clause, and I went in there and said I'm going to be moving 50 miles away, 52 miles away or whatever it was, and of course they wanted proof and everything else.
Right.
Um, I mean, you could get that strict with it and specific and say if it's over 50 miles. But again, I feel like in a lot of cases, if you're dealing with somebody who's already has it in their mind, they want out, and you're just, you know, being nothing but resistance for them, it may not be worth it to even, have that argument with them. So,
Exactly. Yeah.
it's not a bad idea to put it in there, but I mean,
I don't think
it,
it's necessary. It makes more sense to just know that you're going to be reasonable with them if something comes up. Again, the whole concept of keeping cash for keys in the back of your mind. You can work with them and negotiate with them. You might get an extra 2 weeks rent out of them that covers the gap for you to re-rent the property, which means maybe you only have a couple of weeks of vacancy that you have to cover. But at least you know that they're going to walk out of there leaving the property in good shape. And that's as important as anything. When it comes down to it, if you can just turn it around and re-rent it right away, that's going to save you a lot of headache, a lot of time, and probably a lot of money. So be reasonable. If they're moving and even if it's 25 miles away, but it would take them an hour and a half to commute to work, what does it matter? So it's only 25 miles, but it's a long commute. How many people are really going to do that?
and it's really important to look at the big picture as a landlord a lot of times too. If if the tenant starts to become a real pain for you, or if they're starting to give you a lot of resistance, is that really a relationship you want to try and continue with anyway?
Exactly.
So, I mean, I think a lot of times, in these cases, it may be a way for you to also get kind of a fresh start too.
That's
If
right.
it's the type of person that's willing to lie about their job transfer and willing to go to great lengths to try and prove it, you were probably going to run into this situation in one way or another down the road anyhow. So
Yes.
you might as well back out while you can reasonably and move on. I mean,
Hmm.
really. So losing their job is another one. That's obvious. And again, from a landlord's perspective, you have to be, you have to think about it. If they're not going to be able to pay, what's the point of trying to give them a problem? Say, okay, well, I'm sorry you lost your job, and let's figure out how we're going to end this, and what your move out time frame is going to be, and let me in there as soon as possible so I can start showing it and turn it around.
Yes.
Extraordinary circumstances. Um, this unfortunately does happen where tenant might go through a divorce or diagnosed with cancer or other type of ailment that maybe causes them to live in, assisted living, or, just basically they can't live in that property anymore for one reason or another.
Right.
And again, you got to be a person, you got to be a human being sometimes too, to to say, okay, I'm sorry you're going through this, and again, let's try and figure out a way to that it's reasonable for everybody, that you're going to have a move out date. I think that's another important thing, is to actually get dates in mind.
Hmm.
So you're not running into a situation where they're procrastinating or stalling, and get it in writing. Hey,
Yes.
here's your last day. I agree to it. Here's what I agree to as a final payment or whatever, and we're going to each go our own way.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of pieces of that, because also you want to think about turning that around as quickly as possible. So can you show it while they're still there
Hmm.
and work out an agreement in writing that meets your state and local laws, because there are laws that guide you in showing a property when somebody is living there. So you work within that. And again, if you can keep the vacancy down to just a couple of weeks, and you can theoretically come out ahead in the situation, especially if they've lost their job, they're not going to be able to make the rent payments anyways. You're bottom line, you're an idiot if you try to fight them and try to
Right.
keep them in there, because that's what the lease says. In my opinion, a lease from a landlord's point of view gives you a little bit of control from a legal standpoint, but not a lot. More importantly, a lease, again, from the landlord standpoint, you should think of it as something that is providing increased incentive for your tenants to stay for the duration of the lease. It's not forcing them to stay. They can walk away anytime. And unless you decide you want to spend the money and the time to take them to court, you're going to get little or nothing for them breaking the lease. So don't think of it as this money in the pocket that is going to give you something at the end of it. It's really just incentive for them to stay for a whole year instead of maybe just leaving after 9 months. It gives you an opportunity to somewhat plan for when it might come vacant.
Right.
Beyond that, it doesn't have that much value to us. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who might disagree with me, but I don't like going to court. I will, if it's a month's rent that I might get from going to court, I don't want to have to go to court. I'd rather ensure that they walk out, hand me the keys on a mutually agreeable situation, mutually agreeable terms, and know that they're not going to wreck my unit.
Yeah. And I think for landlords, principal becomes very expensive. You
Yeah,
know,
that's a good
the
point.
yeah, the idea of, well, this is what's right. You got to get past that, because the world just doesn't work that way for landlords, unfortunately. You may be right in every way, and it's still not going to turn out in your favor, or it's still going to cost you a ton of money to fight it. So, just remember, as a landlord, that principal can be very expensive. There are times where it just makes sense to make a decision that that allows you to move on, versus trying to stick somebody with something that they may have agreed to. And like I said, they may have signed over everything, but at the end of the day, that lease agreement is going to work more in the tenant's favor anyway than the
Exactly.
landlord's. So
Exactly.
the last thing I'll bring up with Kevin Perk's article here is, he says another good reason to let them out of their rent, or out of their lease rather, is because they're a pain in the neck. and and we've certainly covered this a bunch of times, and I think the one sort of interesting point to pull out of it that he wrote was kind of a preempt into cash for keys. I like his approach here. He says, when you reach a point where you realize that they're just being a pain, maybe they've got all kinds of maintenance requests, and you can't seem to make them happy, and you've done what you've needed to do, and they're expecting more beyond that, or whatever the reason may be. We've all dealt with these types of tenants.
Hmm.
At some point you may just decide, I don't want to deal with this tenant anymore. So what he says that he does is he just writes to them and says, I don't think that this is the home that you're looking for. I can't seem to meet your needs. I'll be happy to let you out of your lease so that you can find something that better fits your needs. And like he says, at that point, they're either going to move out, and you'll be rid of that problem, or they're going to tone themselves down after they realize that you've reached your limit as well.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a good preempt into cash for keys. So let's say that it continues, or it didn't get the response that you hoped for. Now you at least tried the very diplomatic way, and now you can make a decision on how to move forward. But I think this is a good approach. This is a good way to set the tone and say, clearly this isn't working. I'll let you out of the lease and see what they say after that.
I really like it. And
Yeah.
I agree with him that he says, they'll either move and you'll be rid of the problem, or they'll tone themselves down. And I think that really makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure based on his experience, he's seen that quite a bit. So I would definitely keep that as an option. If you've got one of those problem tenants, it's a great way to go. It can't hurt to just send them that letter or email that suggests that you're happy to let them out of their lease and let them find something that works for them.
Yeah, and in your one of two situations, if they turn it into a bad situation and say, I'm not going to, or this, no, it's not going to work, then you may want to consider cash for keys. You may want to consider getting them out, as fast as you can,
That's right.
without them damaging the property, so that everybody can move on.
Yes. Now, when I said a few minutes ago that leases really are only of benefit to let the tenants keep them there for the full length of the term, that's only talking about the term, the length of time that the lease agreement is agreeing that they will stay. All of the other details within the lease agreement or rental agreement, if it's a month-to-month lease, those are very important. And so I think of those in a much different way, because those are really the terms of the rental, not the terms of time that you're going to be staying. So I just wanted to be clear on that, because I think there are many very important pieces of your rental agreement that you have to have and will be very valuable and useful to you when you run into problems. I just wanted to clarify that. I didn't want to get a lot of emails saying, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah, don't scratch the lease. You're going to need that.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
I agree with you.
lease agreements, 1-year agreements are important to us as landlords too. And as I said, it really puts in the tenant's mind that they're there for that year, and then when they renew their lease, they're there for another year. It allows you to plan, and I think some percentage of the time, maybe 80%, 70%, right in there, you're going to be able to plan on your calendar that when your tenant leaves, it's going to be a year from when they signed the lease or the renewal. Whether they've been there for a year or 5 years or whatever, you're not going to have to expect that suddenly 9 months into the term or 6 months into that term that they're going to move, because most of the time they're going to see that as their commitment. And
Right.
it's only those, these 5 situations that we talked about, and then the occasional problem tenant. But usually, if they've been there for a year already, they've renewed their lease, and you want to have them there, the odds of them being the type of a problem tenant that's just going to bail in the middle of the lease is kind of limited.
Yeah, and the last thing that I'll bring up too, and sort of looking at this from the perspective that we do a lot of verifications, one of the things that we ask landlords when we're calling for reference is, what was their move in date and what was their move out date? What you're looking for there is a pattern. If they've done this in the past, if you've got an applicant who has never fulfilled a lease term in the past, 2 or 3 properties they've been at, there's a pretty good chance that you're probably going to have the same situation.
That's a
So
good point.
yeah, so just keep that in mind, and especially if you're calling, which you should be, their previous landlord's current landlord, find out how long have they been there. Did they fulfill their lease term? We see both. I would say it's a mix. We see both sides of it, where yes, they fulfilled it, and we definitely see our share of people who don't. And it's easy to spot that pattern when you're looking at their address history, to be able to say, okay, they were at this place for 9 months, they had a year lease. They were at this place for 6 months, they had a year lease. I'm probably not going to be any different than these other people.
Right.
I can't expect them to be here for a year in that case.
Perfect. Well, I think that wraps up another episode of Night School. I look forward to talking with you tomorrow evening.
All right, Jeff, thanks.
Thanks for listening to Landlord University, and remember to visit rentprep.com/landlordu to see show notes and access free resources like forms and guides. And be sure to check out Jeff Pearson hosting his own hit podcast at thementorimpact.com.